All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar on transforming MedTech with AI. Title: Balancing Compliance and Innovation in a Changing Regulatory Landscape. So a bit of a wordy title, but the idea today is to get a sense of what is happening in a highly regulated industry such as medical devices so that we can better position our organization to be able to address upcoming changes. There are certainly a lot of uh, webinars going out right now about these emerging standards. But what we decided to do was to focus on a set of activities and a set of new insights that hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll have more clarity on some recommendations on what to do next. The audience for today's webinar is individuals that are already working within a regulated industry and that are exposed to a quality management system. Usually, if you're in aerospace, if you're in medical devices, there's already a lot of strong prescriptions around what to do and how to do it. And we see that the emergence of AI requires us to have the same type of approach and the same type of direction for how we choose to implement the AI oversight within the organization. Other people that are invited to this call are technical leaders that are in the MedTech space that do want to see what is the evolution of ISO 13485 and what is the changes in regulatory landscape around the world. And last group of people are individuals that are presently working in regulated industries that see that probably med is going to have an impact, followed by changes in other industries. This agenda for today is going to be divided into three parts. First off, we're going to explore what is the state of the AI regulatory landscape. We're going to look at its maturity. We're going to see what are the upcoming changes. We're going to see what is the emergence of certain regulations happening around the world. Part two is we're going to talk about how to improve your existing quality management systems to the best that we can cover today because we only have a short amount of time. And we're also going to end the presentation with a set of tactical recommendations that we've seen in our experience that would provide you with the most amount of benefit for the least amount of initial effort, or at least getting the highest return on investment for these types of implementations. If you want to focus on what you should take away from today, there are three major considerations that you should write down. The first one is getting a sense of what are the trends in the changes in AI regulation. The second one is what are the specific add-ons that you can attach to your quality management systems with a advent of various standards. And the last one is going to be what are the key recommendations for future-proofing your AI systems? Obviously, there's a lot that we can do here, but like I said, what we found is there's very key activities that a team can perform in order to ensure that they have the most amount of future success. If you're part of this call, we recommend that you have the following three areas of knowledge before joining us. You can look him up during the call, but we want to make sure that you understand what is a quality management system, what is ISO 13485, what is ISO 9001, what is IS 9100, whatever is applicable to your particular organization. We're going to hopefully you also know what are the regulations that your organization is already exposed to, whether you be in Europe, whether you be in North America, or whether you be in ASEAN. There are certain regulations and laws that you must follow in order to participate in these regulated industries. And finally, if you want to contextualize how to implement AI within your organization, it's best to understand what are the existing AI initiatives that your organization is undertaking. If you have all of those three things, we think that the call today is going to be very useful. So who are we to present this webinar today? Well, LeMay has been around for a long time. We are a team of data scientists and engineers that have worked in multiple regulated industries. And with our ability to treat our AI engagements as engineering projects, we actually follow very closely the requirements management, solution architecture, verification, validation, and ongoing monitoring that is prescribed in other quality management systems such as ISO 13485. So we felt really comfortable to be able to continue the direction that we were taking when it came to designing AI systems in the spirit of ISO 13485, something that we haven't really seen in the industry. A little bit about myself. I'm the CEO and co-founder of LeMay.ai, done 10 years of AI consulting. Graduated in electrical engineering, and I'm also a licensed professional engineer under the laws of Ontario. I have a background working for a MedTech startup where we've implemented ISO 9001, ISO 13485 from scratch. And just recently, our leadership team, including myself, became ISO42001 lead auditors. So we find that across each one of these elements, we hope that the webinar today is going to be quite material. Part one. Exploring the AI regulatory landscape. So for those of you that have been paying attention to the news, there's no shortage of new laws that are coming out, new regulations that are coming out, new changes that are happening in real time. There's finally been, with the push of the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, a strong directive for other regulations and jurisdictions around the world to implement such a particular law that provides oversight to AI regulations. But what we found is still it's not as tangible as most people would want it to be, and it's certainly not prescriptive in terms of the types of activities that you would want to pursue. There's the IAPP Global AI Law and Policy Tracker that we prefer to follow, as it is motivated by a nonprofit. They do keep oversight of all the regulations that are happening from jurisdictions around the world. But we also find that if we look at UNESCO and OECD and a few other observatories, we can get a sense of what are the laws that are happening in place. When it comes to the materiality of these laws and how they come into effect, the IAPP actually spoke very clearly about what is happening with these laws. So they do talk about the fact that there is no standard approach to bring AI under state regulation. People haven't really figured it out. It's pervasive across multiple domains. They're not sure yet on the direction that it wants to take. We also know that given the transformative nature of AI technology, finding a balance between innovation and regulation of risk is difficult. Sometimes there hasn't been enough innovation in certain industries due to the fact that there were some overbearing regulations in place. And some other times there was some unnecessary public safety risks because of the fact that innovation outgrew the existing set of regulations. So it's always going to be a battle to identify what is the correct balance. One thing that the IAPP points out, though, is the last point, which is technically or typically what happens is there's first a national strategy or an ethics policy that comes to light before you see what comes to law. So if you're participating in a certain market, if you're participating in a certain jurisdiction, if there is a national strategy that has been established, there's a good chance that it's going to move towards a law and then to a regulation afterwards. Distinguishing between governance and compliance. When we started our business back in 2016, we noticed that there weren't really any major mechanisms for providing management level controls to AI projects. AI was still in very early stages of corporate adoption. It was more of an internal curiosity, and with some statistical methods and data science, we found that most teams just benefited by very simple scripts. And then by 2018, 2020, it grew very aggressively to requiring a lot more management oversight. However, with management oversight, there weren't a lot of prescriptions. There was only a set of high-level objectives. There was strong governance, but not a lot of compliance associated with each one of these activities. So first came the AI governance frameworks. It was quite popular a few years ago. It really talked about why things should be done, and it was entirely internally mandated. So there was no strong incentive other than maybe some marketing purposes or to align with your mission, vision, and values. There really wasn't a reason why teams should adopt AI governance frameworks. So we're talking about the risk AI management framework. We're talking about other types of structures that exist, but overall, we find that due to the lack of material consequences and due to the fact that everything was custom and reinterpreted on a per company basis, it was very difficult for companies to justify the initial investment in establishing this AI governance framework. Now, what we're seeing is the emergence of AI regulations coming out from various jurisdictions around the world. These regulations talk very clearly about the fact that oversight should be effective and it is legally mandated. What we're expecting to see, that we're going to talk about in a second, is that a lot of these laws, regulations, and standards are going to be incorporated in these jurisdictions so that the mechanisms of compliance can be reproduced across organization. Without compliance to these regulations, it may trigger eventual penalties or disqualify certain companies from participating in particular industries or markets. So the EU AI Act is a good sign that these regulations are coming, but even the act itself is slightly inconsistent, a bit unclear, very obfuscated in what it actually means, or people are uncertain as to how to approach it in order to implement it within their organization. Now what we're seeing is finally there are some standards and some compliance frameworks that are emerging. This really talks about how the activities should be performed internally. It talks about how your team should be structured. It talks about what type of reporting chains should be implemented. And it is going to be externally mandated. So if you have the AI regulation that's in place, it's going to require companies to pursue some of these standards. We know that from the early signs that we've seen, especially with ISO42001 that we're going to talk about a bit today, the standardization of these frameworks across organizations is much, much easier as it aligns with other more complex standards such as ISO 13485. We know that it can be reproduced across penalties, and this also, if there is non-compliance, it may also trigger penalties. So for example, if, for those of you that ever missed an audit in ISO 13485, there's a lot of conversations that are very strict and very aggressive to be able to answer why these shortcoming happens, what can we do to change, how can we adjust it, and ensure that we have some corrective and preventative actions moving forward. So why are the regulatory changes accelerating now? Feels like they're in the news more than ever before. It's really due to three main reasons that we've observed. The first one is, with every generation, AI is becoming more complex, integrated, and pervasive. So if you've worked with a connected medical device or with a semi-intelligent medical device, a few years ago, IEC 62304 was pretty straightforward in how the software needed to be written, but the software was also very much contained to the device itself. Now what we're seeing in the MedTech space is AI is not only used as part of the medical treatment itself, whether it be on the diagnostic or treatment recommendation path, but it's also participating in the drafting of the code, the reports, the SOPs, automating a lot of the internal business functions, which creates a highly dynamic, much more volatile system that new employees and managers may have some difficulty having full oversight on. So there is a strong reason as to why there is a need to have a lot more oversight of AI systems, because they're now actually going to be a lot. There are going to be across the organization much more present. The second thing is that every company in the world, most countries in the world right now, do tout that AI provides some greenfield economic future. If countries are intended to pursue an AI strategy, that means that there needs to be clarity around the safety and assurance and the fairness of its use across each one of the individuals within the country. So we find that if there is to be motivation around these new adoptions of AI across different countries, there needs to be a very strong framework legally present to ensure that this is delivered successfully. Finally, what we've seen is that of all the fields of AI and of all the generations of AI, GPTs or generative AI are also called GPTs or general purpose technologies. So if you think of printing presses, if you think of electricity, if you think of major transformative technologies throughout the various millennium, AI is seen in this day as manifested by generative AI as a tool that can be effective in almost all domains for almost all activities. Now, there is a strong debate around quality, reliability, and data privacy issues, but general purpose technologies are very much a clear sign that this technology is here to stay. It's not just going to be a fad. So with these 3 points, that motivates regulators around the world to ensure that there is a strong and effective framework to ensure that this is delivered successfully. What we believe is going to happen over the next 12 to 18 months is that regulations around the world are going to be pushed with a type of incorporation by reference to include standards to ensure that people follow the specific activities. A few years ago, when we worked with Justice Canada, we had long discussions about the very particular mechanisms that jurisdictions use to include technical standards within laws. So when certain regulations and countries were founded around the world, laws and regulations prescribed what were the safety requirements of various industries, whether it be health and safety equipment, whether it be public-facing equipment, whether it be bridge building, road building. It was all mandated within laws. But as the fields of technology emerged really quickly, what these regulators sought to do was to ensure that there were mechanisms in place to allow for technical experts to create standards that were then followed. If we're talking about specifically AI, what we're seeing right now is that there isn't really a strong set of mandated frameworks in any regulation around the world, and that's what's going to change. So before we didn't have any laws prescribing AI activities, now those are emerging, and as the regulations that are implementing those laws are coming out, the standards are going to be referenced within that context. How new technical laws are typically implemented follow, there's 4 key aspects of this process. The first one is a law is passed to ensure that safety and accountability principles are traceable. The regulation is passed prescribing safety and accountability objectives, and this is where regulations typically reference a standard. If you take the Canadian Medical Device Safety Act and the Canadian Medical Device Regulations as an example, the regulations explicitly mention references to ISO 13485 as part of the regulation process to ensure that the safety of the equipment is implemented. The regulation typically brings forward a standard created by a standards definition organization, whether it be ISO, BSI, ANSI. There are many players around the world, but these standards are typically put together with joint committees and technical committees, so they do have a lot of technical expertise within them, and that's how they are implemented within, or how they're referred to within regulations. And finally, notified bodies or auditors are agencies that are tasked with the verification of the implementation of said standards across the organization. So where we think AI is going with this particular direction is that as the laws are coming out and the regulations are clarified, they're going to implement standards created by SDOs that can be audited by notified bodies. That is true for medical devices, it's true for aerospace, it's true for even to some extent in fintech. The only difference being that fintech typically has the jurisdiction itself acting as a notified body and acting as the oversight agent. But other than that, all the other industries do follow this standard pattern. And AI in this day and age is expected to be very similar to this. If you look at different jurisdictions around the world, they do have a very clear mechanism as to why they would pursue such a strategy. So Canada has this guide from Corporating Standards by Reference. USA has multiple committees that talk about the mechanisms of including these documents. The UK government established something. The European Union is interesting, although they don't have an explicit mention, or I haven't been able to find an explicit set of mechanisms. They do talk about, for a lot of these regulations, how they go about incorporating it by reference within the text itself. So this is a pattern that we're seeing across every jurisdiction. Now that we know that these standards are coming, we can make a set of assumptions around which ones we believe are going to be put in place. After reviewing a set of AI risk management frameworks, governance frameworks, compliance frameworks, and standards, so far we believe that ISO42001 is the most mature and is the likeliest to be implemented. We haven't seen confirmation yet from various governments, but from the committees that we've reviewed, from the discussions that we've had in different countries, including some individuals working with the German government, we found that ISO42001 seems to have the most amount of upfront structure to allow for organizations to successfully implement safe and effective AI, which means that there is direct translation to its applicability within the medical device field. ISO 42001 is management systems for artificial intelligence. It is designed by the International Standards Organization, which means, just like other standards, it aligns quite nicely with existing QMSs. And just as you're familiar with ISO 13485, there's a lot of subsets and substandards that can be referenced, and including the ones that we actually use as part of our day-to-day activities is ISO 22989, which is the concepts, the terminology, but also the structure, the systems, the pipelines, the workflows that actually ensure that however you build your system, it can be built in a safe and reliable manner. The core differences between ISO 42001 versus 22989 are the same as any other quality management system implementing substandards, with a few recommendations specifically part of applicable to AI. ISO 42001 was finally published in 2023 and does cover policy management responsibilities as well as AI risk assessment, AI risk treatment, and AI system management. But we find that its inclusion of ISO 22989 to be quite powerful when operating a set of AI/ML systems within the MedTech sector. So 22989 implements the very specific types of workflows, the maturity models, the domains of concern for AI. What is your DevOps? What is your explainability? What is your cybersecurity? And as such, we find that if you go about attempting to comply or implementing ISO 22989 within your day-to-day activities, suddenly it accelerates your ability to comply with whatever emerging standards may come out. So one of the key recommendations here is please take a look at ISO 22989. I, due to copyright reasons, cannot share the diagram with you as part of this presentation, but please reach out to me and we'll have a walk through of what this particular standard covers and is this a recommended approach to your organization. ISO 42001 aligns quite nicely with ISO 13485, and with the following sections that are typically included as an add-on. So beyond the quality management system definition that exists in ISO 13485, we include the AIMS. We have an additional section to include the actions to address risk and opportunities. We also have the AI risk assessment, the AI risk treatment, and the AI system assessment. This is where ISO 22999 comes in, where how you go about mitigating risk in your AI management system is by ensuring that there's a certain level of oversight. ISO 42001 right now provides a strong foundational alignment with the EU AI Act, but I will provide the following clarification. At this time, from what we've seen, we're February 13th, and we've been trying to understand what are the regulations that are moving around the world. We haven't seen that there are very specific laws right now prescribing a requirement for ISO 42001, especially for MedTech. So the Genre Institute published an article on January 24th specifying that there presently isn't a law or a harmonized standard that specifically regulate the use of machine learning in medical devices. So they still need to comply with the MDR and IVDR, and typically the relationship between how AI is built and how AI is evaluated in order to be deemed safe and effective does rely on the more holistic ISO 13485 prescription. We do have a mechanism for including that process, but we find that for today's webinar, we need to simply introduce the concept of what is ISO 42001 and the delta between these two standards rather than to really deep dive into the detail. But like I said, please reach out to us. We'll be able to explain you the differences. Closing the thoughts on why we think that ISO 42001 is going to be the direction that most jurisdictions change is that it seems to be the most mature in its ability to address the key challenges that arise when trying to implement automated decision-making systems within MedTech. So whether we're talking about the traceability of the decisions, if we're talking about the auditability, the reliability of the system, a lot of these components are prescribed at other aspects of the standard. So if you pursue this particular approach, there's a good chance that you're going to be ahead of the competition when it comes to this maturity model. Additionally, any other standard that would come out, let's say an organization or a jurisdiction would choose a standard beyond ISO 42001 in order to achieve compliance. So let's say NIST or ANSI in the US comes out with a different standard, or BSI also has a different standard. What we found is the foundational components of ISO 42001 are still extremely material to answer some of these upcoming challenges. These challenges simply being how reliable is your system and how reliable are your decisions that have been automated. We know that there are some limitations right now with this particular standard, but these are limitations that we've seen with most other standards as well. So for example, ISO 42001 doesn't include the prohibition of certain AI practices. It simply provides some additional verification that whatever are your team's AI objectives, you have a mechanism in place for achieving those objectives, not if those objectives are ethical or not ethical. It also doesn't include a categorization of AI systems by risk, because the risk assessment is deferred back to the parent standard. So ISO 42001 is not going to prescribe a risk level. Instead, it's going to rely on ISO 13485 and ISO 13485's ability to prescribe a risk level in order to define what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Same thing when it comes to mandatory conformity assessment for high risk. Again, it's deferred back to ISO 13485, as well as the transparency obligation for certain AI systems. So depending on if your working with at-risk groups, at-risk individuals, or there's a chance of a negative impact following bias, ISO 42001 doesn't include mechanisms for reporting or for additional verification, but it is something that would need to be included if you want to comply with the EU AI Act. Same thing with post-market monitoring and incident reporting. But again, we find that in the MedTech sector, those are already implemented within the ongoing market verification requirements of ISO 13485. So you should already be ahead of the curve with that. Finally, as we're approaching the end of this webinar and we're going to open the floor to the discussion, there's 3 categories of recommendations that I want to share with you today that we've seen in our experience in consulting with other MedTech companies and other regulated companies around the world. The first one is very simple. It's establishing an AI policy. The AI policy defines what are your AI objectives and ensures that you have some direction to clarify with the team what you should and shouldn't do. The AI policy itself is usually pretty straightforward. It discusses what should be done and how it should be done. So it really talks about the structure of the system. If we try to simply approach, though, the implementation of an AI policy, we're not going to see a lot of success. So the recommendation here is start with an AI strategy and then an AI policy. If your organization has a clear directive of pursuing an AI strategy, then the AI strategy defines the AI objectives, and then the AI policy intends on ensuring that you have the deliverability of those objectives and the execution of those objectives. So what you're going to see is between the AI strategy and the AI policy, you're going to have the chain of why you should prioritize certain elements, what are the elements that you should be prioritized, and how are you going to go about implementing the prioritization of those elements. So across all 2 documents, very straightforward. AI strategy is typically prescribed more by the C-suite and the managers. And at the same time, the AI policy is going to be the technical leads within the organization that are going to be working on how and when these specific objectives are going to be accomplished. The next recommendation is establishing an MLOps pipeline. Even if your tooling is quite simple, asset traceability is one of the key requirements that are emerging from the EU AI Act. And I can show everybody a very clear example. And I'll invite you all to the following thought exercise, which is what happens when there's a particular issue and a particular complaint arises. So when you build an AI system, you want to manage your systems and your assets. So you start with your data warehousing that collects all of either patient data or specialized information on how you're going to go about building your model. You have your data artifacts that are going to be created. So your versions, your snapshots, the specific types of files that are signed and ensure that they're used independently for model training. You have your model training system itself that creates the set of models that can be snapshotted as well. Same thing, signed off and traced. And the reason we do this is because once you actually go about running an MLOps system with inference, you want to have traceability of what happened during the inference. So if you see the chain here, all the way to when there's actually a prescriptive event or when there is a recommendation to a patient or when there is a decision that was made by an automated decision system, we have the full traceability back all the way to the data, which may be, if there is an adverse event, a mechanism for verifying that you have everything that you need to answer the question and to reduce the chances of it happening again. So let's switch this to actually asking the question. let's say we receive a complaint from a customer about a potential adverse event a few weeks ago. And we know that our system was AI enabled, and we know that there was a particular issue that was caused by the model that was deployed. So there's two questions here that we're going to have to retrace. The first one is, which version of the model was interacting with a patient? Do we know which specific file? Do we know which specific asset? Do we know which specific mechanism of deployment was used to ensure that, or to verify what happened for this particular model to be exposed to a patient? The next question is, what data set was used to create this specific version of the model? So if you look at the responsibility of these AI systems, it includes a path all the way back to the data science. And therefore, should there be any issue, your risk treatment will require you to have the traceability all the way back to the data that was used to cause the model. If you want to know how an AI system or an MLOps system can be assessed if you're, let's say, less technical or a bit disconnected from the engineering team that is implementing this, you can ask the following questions. So you want to see that your MLOps pipeline is trustworthy. This means a few things. There's a lot of definitions in ISO 22999 and 42001 as to what this means, but the key takeaways that we've seen are, is it robust and resilient? Can it maintain a level of performance and withstand both internal and external disruptions? Is it self-healing? Is it self-balancing? Does it have the ability to ensure that it continues staying up, especially as you change the data, maybe have messy data? Can you go back to a previous version? But there are two special mentions that we haven't found in the standard that we recommend as being part of the verification mechanism for MLOps. The first one, based on the example that I just showed, is it auditable? Can you verify what is the source set of assets for every event that happens, adverse and otherwise, within your treatment plan? And the second thing is, how automated and structured is it? Is it traceable? Is it verifiable? Is it under version control? If you have those two things, typically the automation and the auditability requirements will cause you to design your MLOps in a certain way that will actually be quite advantageous for complying with ISO 42001 and also the emerging AI acts coming out around the world. So the MLOps component is actually some additional engineering that will be extremely valuable for the long run, regardless of if you're going through ISO 42001 or another standard. The last thing, and this is more of a cultural shift that we recommend to organizations, is assume a change is coming. Within the medical device sector, we've seen standards that once established kind of get comfortable and kind of get set as the de facto approach for implementing solutions. ISO 13485 really hasn't changed since 2016. We know there are still some drafts coming underway, but it's going to have 3 years of implementation, and therefore we don't see that that's going to be a highly dynamic standard. Instead, what we're seeing is something that we typically don't see in laws and regulations is that laws and regulations are actually going to change faster than the standards that they're referencing. So suddenly there's going to be a lot of surprise expectations. There's going to be a lot of aggressive changes. Sadly, we think that there's going to be a few very public adverse events when it comes to AI adoption within the medical sector that's going to accelerate these changes. But what's going to happen is very likely there's going to be some very, very quick regulations implementing or prescribing the implementation of standards very quickly. If you want to get ahead of the curve, make sure that you manage your data science team like the engineering team, that they are accountable to objectives, that they are accountable to a set of activities, and that their work is traceable. expand the risk oversight all the way to the data science, which includes the version control, which includes the snapshotting of the data assets that were used for model training. And finally, look at the emergence compliance standards like ISO42001, not just the governance standards like the risk AI management framework, NIST AI risk management framework, and other prescriptive activities. So let's open up the floor for questions. Happy to take a few questions in the chat if possible. Okay, I don't see any additional questions coming in. Oh, Claudius has a question. So first question, are we going to make the recording available? Absolutely. We'll see what we can share. I believe this webinar is also going to be posted on YouTube, depending on what we can perform. And otherwise, apologies for the link being sent late. We'll make sure that everybody gets it. Claudius has an extra question, which is, as a MedTech entrepreneur, how best you recommend navigating the regulatory space? Well, really, this talk exposes the flux that is happening right now in the industry. What we do see is that in order to have enforcement of the rules, it's going to be based on some sort of traceability. Although the compliance certification to ISO 42001 and 22989, well, not 22989, but 42001, and creating a quality management system like 13485 is quite expensive. Getting the foundational work and putting the foundational design in of these upcoming standards is actually quite straightforward and quite easy. Where I still remember where we had a lot of changes back in the startup that I work with was we went through a particular set of procedures, and then we had to redo all the procedures, and then we had to redo all the procedures again. Instead, if you start with the MLOps foundation of just creating a certain level of automation, and then you're able to build on top of it the adherence to the risk management framework that you're preferring, likely ISO 13485, then it's going to be much, much faster for you to have eventual certification, even if changes are arising, because then it's just going to be adjustment of the systems and adjustment of the procedures, not rebuilding your entire technical stack. So if you can implement your technical stack and align your SOPs with that, it's, again, much faster to achieve certification in that context. Are some MLOps platform recommended? Excellent question. Very used to MLflow. There's a lot of cool things that you can do with MLflow. We like, for example, creating a hash and versioning the assets that you're using. What we do prescribe is a set of technologies that are always open source first. So whatever you can do to design your solution open source, you can, in almost all circumstances, have a set of open source technologies that can then be implemented into proprietary cloud environments, rather than the opposite, which is try to take a proprietary platform and move it out into open source or trying to migrate it to another proprietary platform. It's quite expensive. In terms of asset management, we like DVC and and ML flow. We've also used Git LFS depending on certain circumstances, because really the goal of Git LFS is less version control. It's really snapshotting. So there is a way of using that mechanism for having traceability of the audits. When it comes to the automation, we have been strong proponents of Apache Airflow. Because it looks at the entirety of the stack and it is quite reproducible. We also have been exploring the use of N8N to increase the automation across multiple technical domains. So if you're working across very disparate stacks, Airflow is not as good to be able to manage different assets in different areas, but it's really, really good at managing, let's say, pulling the data, retraining the models, and deploying them systematically. That you can all do in Airflow. But if you're looking at trying to collect additional data, or if you have a very complex steps, we tend to look at N8N instead. There's also a few honorable mentions when it comes to obviously Python and Pandas. Hopefully, the data science teams that we have seen, some of them are still using R. If you are working in Pandas and Python when it comes to a data science element, though, it's much faster to integrate to the rest of the automation code, which means it's a lot healthier to have a lot of these processes be developed quickly. We have another question from Claudius, which are there countries that you would recommend as good entry markets with fewer regulations that would allow for experimentation and pilot implementation? Let me break that down into two parts. So the first one is, are there some industries that have less regulations? Yes, there's always some jurisdictions that have kind of less presence, but we find still those are also potentially less competitive or a bit more difficult. We have been doing business in various countries around the world, and even doing business in Malaysia, which doesn't have the same regulatory burden as the European Union. It still relies massively on EU and US trends when it comes to establishing their own regulatory framework. So even if they're not immediately following step by step these jurisdictions, they're usually not too far behind. So it's not that there isn't really a strong advantage. Instead, what we found is that there's a lot of programs intended to accelerate the adoption of new technologies by facilitating research and development activities. When I was in Medica, at the Medica conference a few weeks ago in Germany, speaking with the German regulators, what they said was that they had a really, really strong mandate to reduce the per case cost of their hospital visits. And they were leaning heavily on the adoption of AI to help accelerate diagnostics, triage, follow-up care. Because if you have more effective follow-up care, you reduce hospital visits. And so a lot of these programs have an ability to incubate a lot of these AI ideas safely and effectively. We've worked also with a few other teams. We've talked to a Canadian accelerator venture lab that historically has partnered with the Lakeshore Hospital in order to pursue research and innovation. And we have also seen that the Harvard Neurology Lab also has ties to hospitals across the region in Boston. So depending on which country you pursue, I would start with looking at what are the specific teams of people that are mandated or that are pushing the innovation, and typically they will be able to help you accelerate the market entry. Okay. Well, that seems to be all the questions for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Like I said, we're going to be sharing this recording as it becomes available. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to provide you with some additional insights.